Yeah, well, I'll pay a brief tribute to your. It's been dude, you've been around a while. Hey, when did you first arrive at into CBCS?
March 2012.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Wow. So it's been nearly 10 years, which is it's been brilliant. And Duan's one of those amazing people who works across the various disciplinary boundaries involved in conservation. And refuses to be pigeonholed into one particular place. And it's really been fascinating watching his career grow and span a whole huge range of different topics involving people and conservation, right from very biological things right through to extremely social science oriented pieces of work. Duan's worked a lot with sort of mental models, different ways to think about a range of conservation problems. Hasn't been shy of dabbling in some of the world's most controversial conservation issues, and it's taken some heat for that over the years, and on the flip side, contributed enormously to a huge range of debates within conservation. And it's been really impressive watching that, and the sheer global scale of the collaborations that Duan has built up is really impressive. And the US's gain is Australia's loss, as Duan thinks about, or not just thinks about, actively in the final stages of moving across to the US. So maybe he'll mention a bit about that. But it's been wonderful to watch, and it's been a real privilege to work with you at least a little bit on some of the things over the years, and really looking forward to what you've got to say today, and also to watching the rest of your brilliant career unfold. So thanks very much for taking the time to present with us today. There are people joining left, right and centre as 11 o'clock passes. So the floor is yours, Duan. Thank you very much.
All right. I think my technology is working. Can you all see the slides and hear me?
I can see the slides. We don't have it full screen yet.
You don't have the slides full screen?
No, that kind of stopped just now.
All right. Is it full screen now?
Yes, it is.
All right. And maybe I should get the slideshow underway to get moving.
Thank you.
So yes, I did arrive in CBCS in 2012, as I mentioned, as one of the SEED Center of Excellence for Environmental Decisions postdocs, and it's been at CBCS. All of us that work at CBCS, study at CBCS, are affiliated with CBCS. We're all very privileged, because it is certainly, in my experience, one of the very top, if not the top place for building global networks and global understanding of the different ways to approach conservation issues, and in a way that really does connect to applied organizations, policy organizations. So Richard, you very kindly mentioned the various strands of work I'm involved in, and in all of those, across different domains and in different countries, I've either actively built on networks that formed around CBCS, or the organizations that were before CBCS, UQ Conservation Science, or got underway with things and thought, well, now I'm far away from anything UQ, and then I run into people who did a sabbatical there, run into people who did something else there, and all that's very helpful in terms of actually moving forward with science, and moving forward with science that can inform practice and policy. And actually, where I'm moving to now, Northern Arizona University, the person that I'll be replacing, Tom Sisk, as a chair of environmental science and policy, he was actually spent a sabbatical at UQ with Hugh Possingham in the early 2000s. So it's once part of UQ Conservation Science, CBCS, it's with you for life, and I think that's a really powerful network to be part of. And because of that, CBCS is also in a really strong position, and I think has a responsibility to charter a new path for how we engage as conservation scientists and conservation science as a discipline in our COVID disrupted world, which in many ways COVID has the pandemic and the crisis associated with it has laid bare and exposed the challenges and the issues we were all dealing with before and many of us knew about, but it's really laid them bare and put them out there. And so in my talk today, I'll talk a little bit about those challenges, as well, two of them in particular. Then my understanding of, one of the potentially the reasons why the system works as it is, and we continue to sit with these challenges, at least within conservation, and then look towards some solutions. And then towards the end of my talk, I have a few questions that I'm still struggling with, and I'm putting them out there and hoping that someone here listening today can share some insight. So we'll have some time for a broader discussion. So moving on to the challenges. And it's been clear in the news, in various discussions, in the many protests that we saw in South Africa. They turned quite violent just 2 weeks ago. And it's inequities across scales. And importantly, it's both within and between countries. And at the same time, we're dealing with societal polarization. And around that polarization are the challenges facing science and evidence-based policymaking. So starting with inequity. So specifically in the conservation realm, we really deal with a challenge where people like, Mark Zuckerberg is an extreme example, but wealthy people who live in nice mansions like this, really have a lot of power and influence through lobbying and through the way the system works on how conservation plays out on the ground, especially in lower income parts of the world that are less powerful, and really have a strong interest in conservation, and therefore, have impact on people that live like this in the bottom right slide, and that actually live with the costs of living with wildlife. And so that's a stark inequity and a real disconnect. That's a challenge in conservation, global conservation in particular. Now, part of those inequities, we saw that last year had a lot of protests, and the ones in the United States attracted a lot of media attention, and these come from a long historical legacy. And the US protests were specifically focused on racial inequity, which I think is really important to, draw more attention to dealing with that. I think, and in my talk today, I'm not going to focus as much of that. Those protests in the US were really focused on dealing with racial inequity within the US, which is positive. But I think we really need to also look at other forms of inequity that also really took shape in their current form during the European colonial era. And in this sense, nation state inequity. And so the Financial Times, I read an article there, I think it was last year, they were actually talking about ways the UK could strengthen itself. And one of the basics of that was that so many people want to move to the UK, and the reason is because they're going to be better off. And the reason for that is that the biggest determinant by far of an average individual globally's expected income through life and well-being is not, anything other than the passport with which they are born, or the passports they have access to. Now, nation states and the passports we carry around to move around, this is a European construct from the early European colonial era, and particularly the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So this is, many of us sort of think, oh, well, I carry an Australian passport, I'm Australian, but this isn't that old. And actually the development of the nation state concept and the way it's manifested, particularly in the last 100, 200 years, is not that different from some of the gross racial inequities that we see, and that those protests in the United States were around. Now, talking a bit more about, inequity between countries and nation states. So here's a world wealth map, and you can see the dark green countries are the wealthier ones, and with more wealth per person, and then the others are less wealthy. And if one has a look at this map, and you see the concentration of wealth in, North America, Australia, Western Europe, with a few exceptions around, in different places, that's, there's somewhat of a similarity with, the European colonial project. And so, Western Europe, the territories that they conquered or, occupied, and then the countries and lands that were occupied by people from European origin, where European people are still dominant. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and to a slightly lesser extent, the United States. These are the countries where the wealth is higher, and this is not this is not unrelated to that colonial project and the structures and processes that were put in place as that colonial project, came to an end, specifically in parts of Africa after World War II, and in other parts of the world slightly earlier. So Africa in the late 1800s, this is what it looked like. Different European countries with claims to different parts of the continent. And to many scholars, the legacy of colonialism has morphed into what is called neo-colonialism. And so some research and some scholarship looking into, well, look, what's happened, corruption in places like Africa are very widely spoken about, and an issue that receives a lot of attention, say, in the Western press. And there's some analysis saying, well, the longer a country was colonized for, and the more the more severe that colonization, the more likely that country is to be corrupt. And there's reasons of legitimacy around that. If there's been a colonial power and the government is perceived to be illegitimate by the majority of the people there, then once the colonial power leaves, that perception and culture of illegitimacy, and that it's the right thing to do to try and, break the rules, steal money where you can, or take money where you can from the government because the government's illegitimate anyway, that persists. Then there's been other analyses of, Europe and the promotion of democracy in post-Cold War Africa. How serious is Europe and for what reason? And there's, these analyses, these scholars suggest, well, actually, the development aid is good, but actually, if one analyzes it, it's largely serving the purpose of, those European interests. And there are, going back during the Cold War, there are some statistics I've read, and I'm not, the accuracy of these, one could potentially debate, but I think even if it's partially true, shows us how the world works, and that the majority of aid coming to Africa during the Cold War from countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, was military aid. That's what most of it flowed into, to fight the Soviet-aligned forces, or if it was Soviet aid, to fight the Western-aligned forces. So from that perspective, if the majority of money coming into a recently colonized region like Africa, is for different tribes, different groups to fight each other, aligned with where the more powerful see themselves, it's not a surprise those countries are dysfunctional. So getting to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really caused a lot of havoc, even for us here that are well off in countries like Australia. But it's, as per the inequities globally, the impact has been really, really bad on those that are worse off in the world, countries and individuals. So some statistics here: the pandemic has caused lost progress in achieving the UN SDGs. So estimates of 120 million people pushed back into poverty in 2020. Toll of COVID on human communities, and those protests in the United States last year were very good to raise awareness around and really take action against the behavior of the police in the United States. I think what received much less attention, and I think is equally a problem, is the police brutality in other countries. In Nigeria, 18 people were killed by police enforcing lockdowns in the first 2 weeks. In Kenya, there were similar killings. And this didn't get much attention, and this is part of the inequities of the world that we live in. There's also been evidence for surges in domestic violence, and these issues that's happened worldwide, but it's particularly bad in lower income parts of the world, and there doesn't get much attention, or as much attention either. And then, I don't know, my slides have lost the title for some reason, but here, looking at this slide is about vaccine inequity, and that really lays bare the inequities of our world, is the inequity in vaccine rollout. So high-income countries have a vaccine surplus. So the EU has a surplus of over 500 million vaccines. The UK has a surplus of over 150 million, similarly Canada. So the wealthy countries are looking at the situation being, all right, let's just hoard vaccines and make sure that our populations are okay. And the lower income countries, the countries that are in Africa and elsewhere, many or the majority of which were former European colonies, well, that's we might get to them later. And so this is a graph of vaccine administration, and as you can see, the better off you are. Australia is a bit of an exception in this graph, but generally, the better off you are as a country, the more vaccines your population has. And if you're in a low-income country or situation, well, that's relatively bad luck for you, because you are going to take some time to get your access to a COVID-19 vaccine. Here's another statistic of number of people vaccinated. So looking at conservation more directly in terms of the pandemic, conservation in these lower income areas or low income countries, many post-colonial countries from the European colonial era, they're very dependent on international flows of tourists to sustain conservation, because tourism provides revenue streams and income to communities, national governments, and supporting industries. It provides key sources of revenue to support and fund conservation, and it provides the benefits from wildlife to make up for the costs that people incur of living with wildlife. Living with elephants, living with lions is not, especially if you're a farmer, and not lucky enough like some people are to live in a protected area where they're working for conservation. If you're farming, then living with these animals is really difficult and challenging, and tourism provides some revenue to make up for those costs. Now, as we know, during the pandemic, tourism has collapsed. Here's a graph of collapse in inbound arrivals, reduction in $4 trillion from global GDP due to tourism losses. There's an image from Southeast Asia. And so if we look at the tourism crash and the impacts of COVID in Africa, it's caused increased reliance on international monetary finance. So South Africa and Ghana have taken out big loans, partly because of that loss. Then looking specifically at tour operators, around 90% of African tour operators have experienced a 75% decline in bookings. I have many friends and colleagues in particularly southern, but also elsewhere in Africa, that are tour operators, and these people are really having it tough. And they run companies that employ, tens to hundreds of people, and the revenue source to keep that going is gone. And one of the results from this, from my work in Namibia, talking to the representative of the community conservancies there, and as well as other NGOs in Namibia, is it's a very significant part of the country where communal conservancies, communally held land people decided they're going to change their land use to a conservation land use in the form of community conservancy. I don't think there's another country with as much conservation land, and those community conservancies are protected and conserved areas. Some people, well, depending on the classification you look at, they also, are OECMs, as Rich mentioned earlier, other effective conservation measures in some ways. And some of those communities are now saying, look, we thought we could get into conservation and we could fund ourselves better, and our community would be better off, our children would be better off through tourism and conservation. Now tourism has collapsed. We're thinking we're going to move back to farmland. We're going to get rid of the elephants and the wildlife, and we're going to farm, because maybe we'll make a little bit less money compared to a good tourism here, but at least we are in control and we're not dependent on people coming from abroad. All right, so that's the challenge that we've seen around inequity. And unlike, I was up in North Queensland, fortunately made it up there before the lockdown kicked in, and there, yes, the tourism operators are having it tough, but they're by global standards, they're in a well-resourced, quite functional country of Australia, and there's all sorts of government help and systems for those operators to survive or perhaps to reskill. There are systems like Centrelink where, they can at least personally, they won't go hungry. And in many parts of the world, and in Africa and Namibia, that does not exist. So if your tourism income runs out, you're finished. That's it. You're going to have to really find another way to make money yourself. And that's just another example of the inequities we face. So moving on to the challenge of polarization. And the political historians and systems scholars say, well, you really are able to move forward in society often when there's a big crisis, because people realize things are falling apart and you really need to do things differently. Now, I've been disappointed through this pandemic in the sense that, and maybe it's not enough of a crisis, but the sort of trends that were taking place before the pandemic have been sort of rather amplified, rather than people saying, all right, let's do things completely differently. And so polarization has continued to grow societally. The United States is where I'll be moving to, is kind of at the vanguard of this. That's where it really manifests. And so to try and understand polarization, I did give a talk at CBCS on this before the pandemic in 2019, and trying to understand, well, where does this polarization come from, and why does it manifest in the way it does? And it's associated to some extent with this era of post-truth politics that we live in which debates are largely framed by appeals to emotion and identity. As part of that, tribalism takes hold around debate. So an individual typically, or at least the way it's portrayed in the media, if you are anti-abortion, you're probably not really going to support climate change. There's sort of a bundle of positions that you'll take. And that's because your tribe or your group takes those positions, and it's the same on the left and on the right. Animal rights, animal welfare, veganism, action on climate change, etc., are sort of taken together. And that tribalism and tendency towards it really does not help us use science and inform key societal and policy decisions with science, because that's kind of of secondary importance. It's about the emotion, the identity, and, well, I belong to this tribe and my tribe has this certain position on this issue. And so that really poses a challenge for people like us trying to bring science into especially into some of these more contentious and high profile debates. False facts are reported and used by both sides of, the polarized issue. And science is challenged and misconstrued. I mean, what's the point of seeking better information and knowledge if it is ignored? And that's not what society seems to want for decision making. And also increasingly in the pandemic, and with respect to some of the issues I've worked on, the tendency of organizations or groups to specifically go out and try and get science out there that supports their position seems to still be strong and growing, which is also unfortunate because I think that weakens the whole basis on which the contribution of science to society sits. So why did we get to this place? Why is our society working like this? And this is particularly bad in Anglo-Saxon capitalist democracies like Australia, the United States, United Kingdom. This book I've mentioned before in a talk at CBCS, The Media and the Political Process, actually by a UQ researcher based at UQ, who's now taken one of the voluntary early retirement schemes during the pandemic, but I think really got onto, describing the system of why the news media dumbs us down to death, and social media has not improved that situation. So what that means in our space is that for organizations, specifically large organizations, to survive in this world, imagery, media, and social media need to be very carefully managed. And that image of, well, we're, NGO A, and this is what we stand for. And, yes, our money does come mainly from wealthy Western countries, because that's, those are the global structures we live with. The image is more important than on-ground results or finding lasting solutions, which often have to be complex and nuanced to the complex problems we face. Simple, emotive, and sensationalist messages are favored over nuanced detail necessary for good policymaking. And yes, this does play out in numerous high-profile and contentious conservation issues. So here is an example of one, and it relates to kangaroos in Australia. So as some of you may know, there's a motion underway through US Congress for the United States federally to follow what California did a few years ago, and is to ban the import of all kangaroo products. And this is, the arguments I've read from the California perspective was because the narrative was, well, kangaroos are endangered and Australians are killing too many kangaroos, and this is bad, so the US should stop this and stop the import of kangaroo products. And then there's also a strong animal rights and animal welfare part to this. And this is one of the organizations really pushing this. It's called Kangaroos Are Not Shoes. And as you can see on the slide, it's, the mass slaughter of kangaroos, Save Kangaroos. They've got celebrities on board suggesting they should stop using kangaroo leather in soccer shoes. And so it's really, the imagery is quite strong around this proposed ban of kangaroo imports into the United States. Also, what's come up only over the last, really come up again over the last month, but also organizations, certain animal rights organizations pushed this last year as well. The idea that, the notion that, we shouldn't consume kangaroo because of the zoonotic risk, and maybe it'll be the cause of a future pandemic. There have been statements, the kangaroo trade is a pandemic waiting to happen. Now, the reality of the kangaroo situation, it's one of the most strictly controlled meat industries in Australia. There's all sorts of treatments that are in line with what's done for any commercial meat product and goes above that. There's numerous critical control points that are expected and audited on a regular basis. There's not been any recorded zoonosis, and the government reports and reviews claim that kangaroo meat is hygienic and safe to eat. Now, I mean, I've been part of numerous discussions around the kangaroo consumption issue in Australia, and there are certainly many conservationists who push for, well, we should all be consuming more kangaroo if we do want to eat meat, because that's far healthier for our system than having, you know, cattle roaming around, sheep roaming around. So this, if this goes through, would be certainly, as I understand it, not a good thing for well, A, for kangaroo consumption, obviously, and then B, more broadly for conservation and ecosystems in Australia. So talking from a conservation perspective, now I spent quite a lot of time trying to think this through, is why, and the kangaroo example is one example that's relevant to Australia. In my work, I've been dealing with those sorts of, you know, policy motions and media narratives for many years around African wildlife. And those countries and communities have far less power and far fewer resources to defend themselves against these sorts of, we can, you know, perceive them as attacks or policy motions coming from elsewhere in the world, often not necessarily badly intentioned people, but people with a particular agenda and view of the world. And that really does undermine our ability to achieve conservation outcomes that work for the local people in that area on the ground. So I've been trying to understand, well, why do we continually sit in this situation, and why do so many of the very established organizations in conservation that many of us work with and that I respect as well, and with many great people within those organizations, why do they not stand up to these sorts of notions or proposals, like the one to ban kangaroo imports? And in some cases, why do they actively support them and drive them? And so this is my attempt to describe, well, it's one lens on a system, and yes, it's a simplified schematic. But so what's happening, and this relates back to inequity, and it relates back to and we've got to stand back. This is not unrelated to the European colonial project. Actually, in some ways, it's still an outflown from this. So because money and wealth is largely in wealthy Western countries, specifically if one looks at flows of money for conservation, and therefore, if you're and because the international system and the countries in many parts of the world, especially in Africa, were not set up after colonialism ended, or given the support to actually function as countries. If anything, they were undermined, so that, you know, European powers and, you know, powers else, you know, US powers, etc., could get from what they wanted from those countries, resources, etc., at low cost. So therefore, those countries like, you know, Tanzania, Namibia, Zimbabwe aren't very functional. And therefore they don't have much, there's not much money in them. So therefore, if you're an international NGO that wants to do lion conservation in Zimbabwe, you've got to get your money from donors in wealthy countries, largely wealthy Western countries from urban areas. That's where the money is. So there's, you know, and to get that money, you've got to effectively sell images and stories of successes of your lion conservation work. And in return from that, you get flows of dollars from either government donors or private donors. And then you run projects. And then on the right-hand side of this figure, you have the on-ground conservation and social reality, which, you know, in many parts of the world is very messy. It's not black and white. And so but now that becomes quite, that doesn't make for a good story to sell to your donors. That, well, in some cases, maybe we should hunt lions or kangaroos. We just have to manage it well. In other cases, we should not do it. You know, that doesn't make for a good story to attract money. What works better is to be, well, lions are being hunted and poached. Give us money to ban the lion trade and to stop this and ban lion hunting. And that works more effectively. And if you're an NGO that doesn't do that, you might find yourself out of business, even if you see the problems in it. So what this leads to is a continued situation where what we're doing as the international conservation community is quite disconnected, and importantly, doesn't have the lasting sort of investments on the ground to actually achieve long-term outcomes. And in many cases, there's many forces operating against that because of the global system we're in, and because there's very weak connection and very little feedback between what actually happens, you know, from the donor in San Francisco providing money to the international NGO, and then what actually happens on the ground in Zimbabwe. There's very weak connection and very, very little feedback, unless the international NGO is, you know, shooting people, innocent villagers on their anti-poaching patrols, and it gets into the news. They're unlikely to know what's actually happening. So there's a real disconnect there. So that's the challenge those are, you know, two key challenges that we're dealing with, and they interact, as I mentioned. So what have I been trying to work on as some, you know, ways that may represent examples of solutions to dealing with these challenges if successful? So one of my areas of work has been navigating conflicts over iconic wildlife and the challenge of human-wildlife coexistence. So iconic species like lions and elephants, they get people emotive. Whether you are someone sitting in London who's excited about lion conservation and wants to support it, or whether you're someone sitting in Zimbabwe where the lions roaming around your little village and the few livestock you have that represent your assets and potentially, you know, your ability to survive through to the next summer. In both cases, those lions are going to evoke very strong emotions. And so for that reason, there's often around iconic wildlife like lions and elephants, there's very fervent debate and discussion around, well, is hunting of or shooting of some of these animals okay if they threaten people, or is it not? And so I ran a process in Namibia, was meant to end at the end of last year. Obviously, we had to cut it short because of the pandemic, but talking to various stakeholders and groups to understand the mental models of community groups and other stakeholders around, well, there we were focused on elephants. How do elephants make you feel? How do you perceive elephants in the landscape? And how do you perceive coexistence with elephants? What is that? And what are the steps we need to take towards it? And so that process moved forward. At the same time, I was also working at an international scale and looking, well, this is nice if we do this with some communities and conservancies in Namibia, but we'd really like a process that is agreed upon internationally so our impact is broader. So working there with various international conservation standards, such as the it started with conservation assured tiger standards, now conservation assured standards more broadly, and the IUCN Green List. And now there, the connection to CBCS and UQ conservation is important again, in that Mark Hawkins, who was in the School of Geography, or CEAS, for a very long time, really was the founder of the IUCN Green List. So yet another CBCS connection to be able to work with to move this forward. And so the idea was to bring in some of the processes we need around debating and discussing and navigating the differences around what human-wildlife coexistence should look like, and building that into a conservation standard like the Green List. And a standard is a benchmark that is independently evaluated and verified. Importantly, in our COVID world where tourism revenue is dried out, there are investors looking to provide sources of income and revenue to conservation areas or to communities that are engaged in conservation. And a standard like this can actually certify and verify, okay, well, this community conservancy is following good governance practice, they're following good conservation planning practice, invest your money there. And that could be payments, direct payments for wildlife presence, it could be direct payments to citizen science monitors. And it would ensure that that process is aligned with good governance and respect for human rights to achieve coexistence. Importantly as well, because of the inequities that we deal with globally and the disconnection between the urban wealthy particularly in Western countries, but around the world, and the rural communities that actually live with wildlife, is to have an established and mandated process as part of the standard, where there needs to be mediation and facilitation between those communities and those stakeholders in places like London shouting, "You may never shoot a lion." And so that would be built into the standard. And this standard, importantly, in terms of connecting to policy, there's a 2030, one of the 2030 CBD targets is around human-wildlife conflict, and it can feed into that. Oh, what happened to my presentation? Oh, this is my presentation. My apologies. But so as part of this, to move this forward, we had an international online seminar with WWF, IUCN, TNC, UN Environment, etc., to look at how we could move this forward. And there's a lot of buy-in and recognition. There needs to be a standard like this will be very helpful. There are questions though around, well, how do you actually make it, because the solutions need to be so locally nuanced, how do you connect that to a standard? And so that's part of what we're working through. But the vision that we're really aiming at is that in the current world, we have this disconnect. Someone sits in New York on their, in their penthouse saying, "Oh, this is terrible that Zimbabwe is not doing a better job at looking after its elephants." Tourists, those few tourists that are out might be disconnected from the realities of the local people and oh, well, those are nice elephants, but then those local people are like, "Oh no, those elephants are eating our only food." And then there's a real disconnect in terms of, all right, these are all stakeholders in this conservation problem. How do we find an acceptable solution? So through the process of the standard and having a process of getting these different stakeholders to come together, one gets to a situation, hopefully, where instead of the person in their penthouse in New York tweeting, "This is terrible that Zimbabwe wants to hunt elephants," agreeing, "Okay, it's hard living with elephants. I wouldn't want them in my garden." And the communities also feel that they're getting enough support from the broader community to actually live with elephants. And as part of this, I've got some PhD students working on issues around this. So Abigail Brown, who did a Master's of Conservation Science at UQ, and who I co-supervised with Hugh back in a number of years ago at UQ, is looking at values and acceptability of management options through a large-scale online survey. And so that data and those results can be important background information to feed into the standard. And Niall Hammond is looking at attitudes and manifestations of conflict over wildlife in social media. So I've been, as I've mentioned to a number of you, I've been trying to get out of the wildlife trade space because it's so contentious and I don't really see a room for things to move forward. But through the pandemic and through the various discussions of the role of wildlife trade in the pandemic, I've been sucked back into it. And so, yes, wildlife trade is thought to play a role in the emergence of COVID-19, and it's actively pushed that narrative by certain groups, particularly groups around supporting the coalition to end the trade, which wants to close all commercial supply chains by securing and enforcing permanent bans on markets and trade. So that would include things like kangaroo. So I think, that's obviously a valid position to hold, as one wants to end the trade, but I don't think one should be, and we as scientists should not let groups get away with saying, well, this is a science-supported position, because it isn't. And a blanket solution like a ban to a very nuanced and complex problem that manifests differently in different parts of the world is unlikely to work. Targeted bans can be very important and have a really important role to play, but you can't, a blanket global ban isn't going to do it. But these bans are driven by well-intentioned groups, often from wealthy Western countries, and with little understanding of or connection with complexities on the ground, partly because of what I discussed earlier. the views of the people, and this is important, who depend on wildlife trade and consumption of wildlife are not considered. There haven't been rounds of workshops or discussions with those people. So it's inequitable, the way that this ban is being pushed. And because there's no serious discussion of how to overcome the failings of wildlife trade bans to date through systems like the Convention of Trade in Endangered Species, there's a risk of serious perverse outcomes for public health. And as looking into this and being frustrated with the way the movement was going, you see that we already have solutions to have some wildlife trade and to do so in a healthy and safe way. And actually, again, kangaroos are a good example, and that's through the adoption of food safety standards in the supply chain. So we wrote this up as a small comment in LANCET Planetary Health, and you might recognize Hadnan's name there. He was a PhD student at CBCS, now working with the IUCN's Wildlife Health Specialist Group. And so following that publication, I'm working closely with Hadnan Caceres on the left, Colina Indriswari, who I also met at UQ, Alex Praskowski, who did his PhD at UQ, and Hubert Chung, who did his PhD at UQ as well. And we're looking at case studies of the use of critical control point systems in wildlife trade to just provide an example of how, if one does want to have some wildlife trade, which certainly I think some stakeholders and societies would want, let's look at some systems we can use for that. And Colleen and Alex both helped provide background information and slides for this presentation. So wrapping up now, an exciting move awaits, as Rich said, moving over to Flagstaff near the Grand Canyon for an endowed chair position, a really nice position to do some really exciting and impactful conservation work and conservation science work across these complex sort of human conservation challenges we face. So as I finally wrap up, these are some questions that I said I would put to you, and these are these are things I continue to think about. I think I have the best way I think we can deal with them, or I can deal with them, but I'd like to think someone else has better ideas. So my questions to you as we go into this discussion are, maybe this isn't for this discussion now, maybe this is something just for us all to think about. What should we do and what can we do about the deep structural inequity between nations in our work? We can't change that, but it affects our work and how we operate. What should we be doing? How should we constructively bring science to the table to strengthen decision and policy making in our polarized times, particularly around contentious issues? And how should we go about building new institutions and processes that are more fit for purpose, particularly around the wildlife trade debates, UN bodies, the World Organization for Animal Health, established conservation NGOs, and these institutions don't seem to be fit for purpose to find solutions to the wildlife trade and pandemic risk issue. So, but they're the best institutions we currently have. So we need something new and different. Maybe that's a reform of those institutions, but how should we start going about building those and thinking about those? So those are some easy questions for you all to think about. And so thank you. We still have a little bit of time for discussion. And yes, and as I said earlier, it's been fantastic to be part of CBCS and UQ conservation. And I'll certainly continue to collaborate, and I look forward to giving an in-person seminar and hopefully having in-person belated farewell drinks when I visit next year when the borders open, being optimistic.